Our speaker this morning, Dr. Richard Moss, is, as I looked at his website and see it's elusive to pin down in a very short bio. 30 years ago, he gave up a lucrative medical practice to follow his heart, to follow his energy, much as our retired physician this morning spoke to bring the other side of healing into the world, about being present. How to integrate how yesterday was, being present today, so that you can have a better tomorrow. He's written 6 books. For the past 30 years, he's been a lecturer, a writer. He's given seminars, workshops, been on TV and radio. He has been progressing and continuing to grow in this practice. So he's here today to talk about what's new, what's next. Please put your hands together for Dr. Richard Moss.
I don't know how lucrative that medical practice was. I think if you could get inside my head and watch what was going on over the last 45 minutes, you'd all feel more sane. Because what do I say to people who I know have lived deeply? You know, what do I have? We all have followed our own track in life, and we've been influenced by people, and we've been moved by inspiration, and we've been moved by suffering. And the main thing that I've done that my introducer couldn't really know is most of my work is in retreat. It's experiential. It's if a person is in one particular state of energy and they can really get to a very different state of energy and have a totally different sense of who they are and what it is to be alive and what it is to be part of life, and that's an embodied experience, then it seems to me that becomes the seed for the next stage of evolution for that individual. The ground state. It's almost as if I know what real is in a way that I never knew before, then I know what unreal is in a way I never knew before. I haven't the slightest idea what's going to come out of my mouth. I don't even know how long I'm supposed to be here. I think it's probably a good idea to let the speakers speak earlier and then be able to discuss more. So I don't know what's going to happen today. So many things popped through my head, because I never give the same talk twice, even though I talk about the same thing over and over again. I think just a moment to be quiet so that our hearts can hold why we're here in this room. And if I come as a visitor, and I've been here a few times over the years, it seems to me we gather together for personal reasons and transpersonal reasons. Personal reasons are just as valid. We're lonely. And when we come together and create community, we're doing probably the most important thing we can do for our own health. Physical health, emotional health. Community, relationships. From a transpersonal point of view, we are all individuals who are microcosm of the whole, and we know that anything we've overcome, we carry in our field and gives the possibility that others will overcome that similar thing. So any fear that we've overcome, any addiction we've overcome, any illness we've learned to live with, perhaps overcome, or are succumbing to with nobility, we help others live with nobility. Because we are not bounded by our skin, even though most of the time we act as if we do, or are. There's a field. And the closer we get to ourselves, which means the less we are in internal warfare and have accepted ourselves. And there are things about ourselves we just cannot change, and it's good to learn to accept them. they recur again and again, and we recognize them inside ourselves, these vulnerable places in ourselves, or aspects of our own way of responding to life that come back again and again. It is good to accept them because they're not going to change. I have the same qualities in me now that I have had all my life, best and worst. Not worst in the sense of bad action, but places inside that are very hard to be with, and that we all each learn to be with. So I'm standing here, talking with you, sharing with you. We're all aware that there are 6.5 billion, or wherever we are now in population, that everything we aspire to at some level everyone else does, that we all want love. Deep, deep down, that's probably what every human being wants. And also, we all want to be alive, to feel really vividly, vitally alive at 92, or 82 or 72 or 62, whatever age, to be at the deepest, most alive quality we can have. And we all judge constantly, ourselves, other people, and every judgment kills love. What is it about us? We want love and we kill love. Not just here in this room, everywhere. We are a microcosm for everyone. We want love and we kill love. We stand in a position that puts us in opposition to other people, and if we could use that in a way to have a better vision of ourselves and the other, and come to a consensus that brings the best in each of us forward, then our conflict would be fruitful. So much of our conflict is taking positions, identifying with our own thinking, identifying with our own belief systems, placing ourselves in opposition to someone else, and it's not fruitful conflict. Mothers love their children, fathers love their children, men and women struggle to love each other everywhere on the planet. Our particular way of life is actually more difficult, I think, than our early ancestors had in some ways. If you go to parts of the world where people live more simply, they don't have what we have, and they generally are more happy. It's my experience, and I travel a lot. So what is it that we are uniquely contributing to our world at this point? We meaning modern, contemporary Westerners. It's a really good question. Thomas Berry, who is a disciple of Teilhard de Chardin, he's dead now, Thomas Berry, but he's written a lot about what a new vision for human beings on the planet is. And he talks about us human beings. He says, we are that aspect of nature becoming conscious of itself. I'd like to also think that becoming conscious of our world is also to become lovers of the mystery and magnificence of our world, so that we are that aspect of nature falling in love with itself. If we are called to love, then always anyone consecrated to that, and consecration is a word I use a lot. I've used it, I don't know why, it came into my soul, into my heart at the very beginning of my journey in conscious life, as opposed to ego-driven life. And I still have an ego, and we all have to have it. It's a stage of development, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the ruler. But if we want love, and if we want to be better people, then what life is going to show us is every place where we don't love. In a sense, in order to be whole, we have to see where we're not whole. And in psychology, or at least Carl Jung coined the term the shadow. And in my work, what I've really seen is that first level of what I tried to do, and I do it in a retreat I call Radical Aliveness. It's had different names over the years. Radical meaning the root of the core of, or core experience of being alive. So I've kind of for 35 years now created an art form for tricking people into being so alive that they, tricking, inviting, playing, adventuring, so that there is this new touchstone for what it means to really be alive. And then I find that people want to continue that work, but I can't keep inducing higher states of consciousness in people from the outside. I can't create the context in which that happens. It tires me, but it also doesn't let a person learn. So the next stage of my work is always how to teach others how to do that for themselves. And I know that we can't do it for ourselves, by ourselves. We do it for ourselves with each other. And when I do a program I call my mentoring program, where I accept or invite people to spend 3 years, a week every 6 months for 3 years. And the major thing that I do in that work is help people develop the weakest parts of themselves, and particularly the shadow, because we don't need to improve our strengths. We in the West cast a gigantic shadow, gigantic. And that's a whole conversation I don't really want to go into, but some of the examples are that the way we eat is pretty destructive to us, and now it's all over the world. I mean, and you can go anywhere and find McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken, and so wherever you find that, you start to find more heart disease, and you start to find more depression, and you start to find more type 2 diabetes, and you start to find more cancer. And so that's one example. Another example is, take the Japanese. They had a real respect for a time in life where a person would go into involution and into darkness and experience what we would label depression, but they didn't label it that. And it was always a passageway to usually the next stage of life. That so-called period of depression was actually the gradual, gentle entrance of what had to be repressed through all the earlier part of life, what had to go into the shadow in all the earlier part of life in order for the individual, any of us, to reach a particular point in life. You have to exclude so much. And then there comes a point in life where life says, or the soul says, it seems to be built into us in an evolutionary sense, where what we've excluded, whether it's at what we've excluded in terms of what we don't let ourselves examine cognitively, what we've excluded in terms of what we have been afraid to let ourselves feel, in order to continue to be very functional in our world, we exclude certain feelings that would interrupt us. Those things come back. They want, something cries out and says, if you want to go to the next stage of wholeness, everything that you've excluded now must be embraced. And so this return of this darker part of ourselves comes, and it's often called depression or spiritual emergence or awakening, because we rarely awaken to the light. We awaken to the dark, and by embracing it are brought to the light. And that's the experience I have observed. That was my experience. So the Japanese, for example, had a very noble respect for this thing that we call depression, but now we've exported our pharmacological adventure, big pharma business, and we're defining depression in very specific ways that take away the naturalness of it, the essentialness of it, the integrative process of it, the humility that comes from it, the compassion that comes from it, the coming to your knees so that you realize that you really can't make it by yourself. And we're medicating people there, and we're using definitions for illness. It used to be 40 years ago, depression, there wasn't many medications for it, but you would have to be really sick for a long time before you would be treated. 20 years ago, you might stay in a period of depression for 6 months before you'd be treated. Nowadays, you'd be treated to the first signs of depression, medicated within 2 weeks. So I'm just saying that as a parenthetical. The big shadow of the West. Our big shadow, gigantic shadow, is what we're afraid to feel. And what we think we can cure with medications, which have validity in certain extreme moments when people are really overwhelmed. John Robbins, who renounced his inheritance from the Baskin-Robbins ice cream fortune, has written many books about nutrition and diet, but one of his more recent books is called Healthy at 100. And he looks at cultures around the world where people tend to be long-lived. And I was sharing at dinner last night with some friends of mine. In one of these cultures, physicians examining these people, trying to understand why they live so long, why they have complete faculties at 92, which you seem to have. Wonderful, you know, and why even at that age they are so physically active, because they have 2 doctors, their left leg and their right leg. Almost all of these cultures live in mountainous terrain. Almost all of them eat the food that they grow, pick it the same day they eat it. But one of the old gentlemen was asked, well, do you experience depression? And he said, when I need to. And so they asked, what do you mean, when you need to? And he said, well, years ago, my son died. I was depressed. But that was a long time ago. Yeah, and quite a long time ago, my house burned down. I lost everything. I was depressed. That was a long time ago. We don't live in the immediacy of the present moment the way people who pick their food at the same moment, cook it at the same moment, have to walk up the mountains to their goats or whatever, and they're constantly walking, constantly sharing their lives with other people. Their homes are open all the time. Their relationships are much more transparent than ours, but also much less psychologically sophisticated. I mean, it's not that we've gone backwards. We've become conscious of so much, but we've also lost simplicity. We've lost naked simplicity. And you can't have a relationship that thrives with yourself until what you've buried comes forward and you accept it and integrate it. And you can't make a relationship between you and another person work because you love each other. If you ask, what does the relationship need? Not just what do I need? It needs not only our strengths and our courage and our beauty, it needs also our shadows and the ability to expose our shadows to each other in very honest, simple, undefended, fearless ways. And this is not what we do. We are attacked for anything that might even be vaguely called a shadow. But I know in the most healing things in our lives are relationships that work. I think that that takes precedent over the best form of nutrition, if we were able to have that. And for relationships to work, we have to have a relationship that works with ourselves. That was one point. How am I going to have a relationship that works with myself if I poison myself moment by moment by identifying with my own thoughts when those thoughts create emotional contraction? So the simple thought, I'm not good enough, or I'm not lovable, is a thought. And the thought causes an immediate arousal, which we all understand. Poisons us in the present moment. And in my books, my last 2 books, The Mandala of Being and the current one, Inside-Out Healing, what I try to show people very simply is the way that we create a shadow. I don't language it quite that way in the book. When our minds leave the present moment and we identify with a thought that judges ourselves, we either puff ourselves up or shrink ourselves down. But you don't see a person who's really balanced and has deep humility and deep aliveness that's either puffed up or shrunk. When you need to, you're depressed because things happen in life that hurt. And you let them hurt and they pass through. If you add thoughts to the hurt, like, I shouldn't feel this way or I have to get over it, then you add suffering. The thought creates more stress and makes it much worse. What's grief? Grief is something we all have to experience, but grief with anger or grief with guilt, thoughts like, I should have done more, that's very poisonous. He shouldn't have done that. He should have tried to take care of himself better. Those kinds of thoughts just turn something that is a mystery, like grief, into an emotional contraction. So that inner warfare of being so mindful that we observe the thoughts we say to ourselves, and we begin to let them go. We step back into the present moment, back into our breathing, back into our bodies, slow things down a lot. Kind of an implicit question. What is actually happening now? Like sitting here right in this moment, what is actually happening now? And letting yourself experience the answer to that with your whole body. Not just your cognitive faculties, also with your feeling. I hear this artificial fireplace, which actually is a lot quieter than a real fireplace. But the sound is not intrusive. I hear it. I feel my weight in my body. I feel a little nervousness in me, which is partly our collective energy and partly the vulnerability of speaking to you and all the perceptions of the colors, the traffic sound that I can hear from outside. What isn't happening right now is condemnation of myself through a thought about myself. What isn't happening right now is poisoning of myself through a judgment of someone else. We either elevate people or we diminish people. We either elevate a situation, diminish a situation. We make money very important, we make money unimportant. We make God very important, we make God very unimportant. And we are the victims of, or better said, we are the creations of whatever we create. We are the creations of the God we create. I don't really worry about if there's a God. I would never know. I worry about what I believe about God. I am the creation of my beliefs about God. I am the creation of my beliefs about my partner. Believe something about my partner that he's not or she's not caring enough or sensitive enough or open enough. And what that creates in me is unhappiness or anger or resentment. We can be the witnesses of this. And if we do witness it, it's to diminish conflict within ourselves so we can be better vessels for the love and the aliveness that I think life is always calling us to. But I have to be willing to accept that I am critical or I am judgmental or I am afraid. I meet a lot of men now that are willing to say, I'm afraid. You know? But in the culture itself, the general culture, men don't admit it very easily. Imagine, would you have elected a president that said, I'm afraid? There was a good study of CEOs, especially with the recent economic crisis, but this was a long-term study, and it showed that leaders of businesses that were more on the depressive side and cautious and less and further away from optimism ran their businesses more successfully and made fewer mistakes than leaders who were optimistic, positive, brilliant, and upbeat, and grandiose. They had to project a grandiose persona, right? And they made bad choices more often than people who didn't, who project a grandiose, but projected a more cautious, not necessarily depressive, but cautious persona. But if you go in front of the public and you say, I have a shadow, I'm afraid for what's happening to human beings in the West, I'm afraid to what's happening to our children, I'm worried about these things. Al Gore finally did it with his discussion of global warming. You don't get elected. We elect people who have gigantic shadows because we're afraid of our own. We ask for leaders who have gigantic shadows because we're afraid of our own. And we often choose partners who we don't think have shadows. But when we reach this stage of life and enough relationships have come and gone for one reason or another, one of the things I teach in my work is what I call consecrated conversation. The ability to sit down with somebody and call it a sacred time, create some sort of ritual object. In Native American tradition, they talk about a talking stick. One of you takes the talking stick, and you speak whatever you're struggling with in yourself, whatever's important, whatever you think the relationship needs to hear. Not necessarily your partner, but what the relationship needs to hear. Of course, your partner needs to hear it too, because he or she is part of the relationship. You don't talk for a long time, because people who talk for a long time don't want to be heard. People who use a lot of words, when you say a few things to them, haven't heard you, and they don't want to really acknowledge that they've heard you, and they haven't really listened. And then you put the talking stick down, and you wait. Because when a person reveals themselves in that form, they've come closer to themselves, and usually when we use words in that way, we don't know where they're going to go, so we come closer to ourselves in surprising ways. And that creates an energy. And if the two of you wait, that energy is in the field, and the field is really the relationship. The field is the nourishment of the relationship. And the field gets a little stronger, and then comes your turn, and you pick up the talking stick. And the first thing you do is not interpret what you've heard, but try to point out what you heard was most important that your partner said. It seems to me that what I heard that was really essential to you in those 7, 10, 8 minutes that you spoke is this and this and this. And then you go on into what that might have called forth in you, and speak about how you relate to that, and what's equivalent in you about that, and does it make you insecure to hear that? Does it? Did you hear things that were true? You know, one of the most wonderful conversations is when you say to someone, "I don't want to make any judgments, but here are my judgments," which is a big difference than judging. Okay, and because I don't say you are. I say I judge you this way. Okay, I don't want to make you stories about a person, because that always starts conflict. You are this way. You are this way. Doesn't work. And so now the second person has spoken for a while, and you put that talking stick down and you wait. If this communication is really effective, the field grows. If the field grows, for the rest of the day, as you pass each other, you want to kind of rub against each other. Your eyes meet, a warmth is exchanged. Maybe that night you want to make love, or maybe right away. So most of us don't have an understanding of field. We understand cognitive mind, thoughts, belief systems. We understand sensate mind. We understand our emotional reactions, our emotional state. We recognize what we're feeling sometimes. But we don't get quiet enough to listen into the space within us and around us that all of us are contributing to, which becomes more or less coherent depending on how deep each of us rests in the now of ourselves, or the center of ourselves. And you can't rest there unless you've brought the shadow forward. You never will. Unless what was buried comes forward, you can't actually rest in a place where you are coherent in a way that causes an energetic, a field phenomenon. And once you can feel the field, not everybody can, that's what changed in my life. I suddenly woke up and felt the field all the time. And I know I'm not even the same person with different people. I know I don't even have the same physiology with different people or in different rooms or with different groups. And I know that if I stay deep inside myself, either in my silence or from where I speak, I change the field in the spaces that I'm in, the people that I'm with. Sometimes over time, if we all cooperate, we create such an enormous field, such a powerful field, that people go through spontaneous remission of disease. Insight comes that you would never have thought could come. We forgive ourselves, we fall in love with ourselves, we forgive others, just because the field is coherent, and love starts to thrive and flourish, and the judgments just begin to evaporate. The love asserts itself, the judgments recede, the mind is in service to the field, as opposed to in service to the ego. Consecrated conversation there are many technologies for it. Many people have discovered in different ways. Harville Hendricks wrote about it in some of his Imago work, the Imago Dialogues. Jack Zimmerman has written a book on counsel. Jack and his wife, Jacqueline McCandless, wrote a book on spirit and flesh, and they talk about couples and what they call counsel conversation, and what I call consecrated conversation. In order for an entity to grow, even this entity, you have to bring the shadow in. And it takes a real hard, this is where we're most threatened, so to bring the shadow in, we have to be vulnerable, honest, and create a structure in which we're not going to polarize and defend ourselves or attack. We are a democratic society. We have begun to admit our shadow. President Clinton apologized to the Native Americans. Right? I think we missed a giant opportunity at September 11th to both say two things. One, this attack was a heinous crime that we will do our best to find the perpetrators and bring them to justice one way or another. And two, hatred and anger in the world happens all the time. What have we done to invite some of that? Not mea culpa, but there's a giant shadow to anything that wants to grow. At what speed does an organization grow? The fastest things that grow in human beings are fetuses and cancers after we've reached full growth. It's either a natural expression of life that grows and grows very fast at a specific point, or after that it's a homeostatic process within inside of us that's constantly replacing what is with new. Or if it's growing very fast, it's unhealthy. It's either a tumor, inflammation, cancer. Nothing grows fast without casting a shadow. And we talk about growth every day without talking about the shadow of growth. And we label economic declines and other kinds of declines as if they're abnormal. But I breathe in and I breathe out. My heart beats systole and then diastole, it rests and fills. I think everybody here knows all this. I use consecrated conversation in my relationship, and it restores us. in some ways, this is a consecrated conversation. I was thinking about the energy behind the idea of how to market yourselves and grow this organization. Maybe spend more time building the field, consciously. But also be completely willing for it to go its own course. I've done groups with 6 people, and I've done groups, long groups. I've sat for a week with 6 people, and I've sat for a week with 150 people. My ego says the small group is less, but what happens in it is different and very rich. And the big group is much more financially rewarding, but it isn't necessarily more rewarding as soon as what I'm doing is being where I am. As soon as I'm simply being where I am, everything is as good as it can be. It doesn't have to be great, it's as good as it can be. Because how could it be any better? It is what it is. And getting past my ego in terms of success, or defined in numbers, or success defined in income, is just getting past my ego. What do I have to tell myself that makes me unhappy? In my books, and I think the newest book, Inside-Out Healing, is the kind of book you would think, do I know someone who's really struggling in their life right now? This is a book which will actually show someone how to heal themselves, at least at an emotional, mental level. It doesn't address diet, which I would say is the other essential ingredient that we have power over, that we can do something about. And from an ecological and environmental point of view, I would urge all of you to start living on a plant-based diet, because it's, just raising the food we eat, the meat that we eat, takes more energy than the whole transportation sector. Airplanes, trucks, buses, and all our millions of cars. It takes more energy to raise meat, cattle, sheep, lamb, chickens, pigs, more energy. So from an environmental point of view, if you want to save energy, buying a Prius doesn't do it. Being a vegetarian does. And from the point of view of having less cancer and less heart disease and less inflammatory disease and less autoimmune disease and less dementia, a whole food plant-based diet does that. And there are other people who are much more expert at that than I am that talk about it. My work has been, my life is consecrated to diminishing conflict within us and between us. To me, that's spirituality. I couldn't care less about satari, samadhi, transcendent states, unitive consciousness, unless it actually diminishes conflict within us and between us. And of course it does. But I'm not interested in being a spiritual athlete to see how long I can stay in satori, or even get people to it. And I do get people to it. But when you have that state, you have to turn around and say, now how does that make a difference in life? How am I going to communicate differently today with every person I'm with? How am I going to relate to my feelings, and particularly the feelings that threaten us and scare us? One of the things I do in the book, and this is the last thing I want to say, is make a differentiation between emotion and feeling. To me, emotion are a category of feelings created by thoughts or images and how we react to those images. And we only react to an image with a thought, with a judgment. So you cannot have an emotion like envy without a thought. You can't have guilt without a thought. You can't have resentment and bitterness without thoughts. You can't have future fear without thought. And you can't have false hope without thought, or even hope at all. There's a natural quality of an individual connected to themselves that gives others hope. But that individual doesn't have to be hopeful. Because what story would you tell yourself about the future that makes you hopeful? And do you need that story to be at the fullness of yourself right now? How many times would we be creating a hopeful picture of the future simply because we don't want to feel what we're feeling right now? And what we need to do is feel what we're feeling right now and make a safe home for what we're feeling right now if we want to be full and healthy, ultimately. So the difference between feeling is that it's completely natural. It just comes through us like weather, constantly changing. It can be ecstatic, it can be blissful, it can be heavenly, or it can be abysmal and dark and hellish. And it's not created by thought. It's created by being alive, and we don't know why. And it doesn't have to have a medical label, but you do have to have methodologies for embracing it. And the best methodology for embracing it is to develop a stronger capacity to stay present and treat a feeling as if you've never felt it before. As Heraclitus says, you can never put your foot in the same river twice. Emotions repeat over and over again because we tell ourselves the same story that creates it. We use the same image and react to that image in the same way. But feeling is constantly changing, and when the ego says, I have felt this before, the ego is claiming something that wasn't created by the ego. We were feeling before we had egos. Infants have feelings. People in coma, if you talk to them with a particular tone and tell them the truth, tears will run down their eyes. I've had that happen twice. I mean, there are different depths of coma, for sure. So to feel something as if you've never felt it before, to say to yourself, I am willing to feel this, and to stand up with nobility, with the feelings that are the most scary, and to not believe a single thought. And the only thing that can generate thought is the ego. Not believe a single thought about why you have the feeling, where it comes from, who's responsible, and what it means about you. Just feel it. And that's what I've learned. And that's what helps people. I'm responsible for my emotions because I create them with my thinking. I am not responsible for my feelings. They just come like weather. I'm responsible to be present with them. And big positive feelings are just as dangerous to us as the negative dark ones, because the big positive ones cause us to want to have more of that and picture the world only in one way. So I think we're almost at the end of my time. If I've stimulated something in anyone, I'd love to hear. Yeah.
Boy, have I enjoyed listening to you. It appears as though you're channeling the information in the moment, and I can see that. And it's unique to see someone be so present as you, and I appreciate that. What I'd like to say is I am one of the two people that were mentioned earlier that is part of the marketing committee for the Inside Edge and its growth. And you said some things that were very specific to some of the things we're experiencing with that growth. And I wondered if you could give us just one or two tips that apply to an organization such as this, that consecrated conversation for those of us that have gathered together and taken on the responsibility to grow this organization and do it with respect to, I mean, you brought up something about you can't have growth without addressing the shadow side. And I'm not really sure how we do that as a board of directors representing this organization. I think that the whole group here would really like to know that, because we are all looking at growth for this organization, and everyone is very committed to that, preserving the community and growing together at the same time in a healthy way.
Wow. Okay. A board meeting has pragmatic things it has to address, I'm sure. Just as, and I would call that transactional. And all relationships have transactional dynamics. What do you want for dinner tonight? Who's going to do the shopping? Things like that. There's nothing in that that's about intimacy or that satisfies our deep, deep need to be seen, to be met, touched, and be touched. Okay? People who want to work in an organization that's consecrated to some quality of consciousness within the participants, within the members, and how those members put that consciousness out into the world, as each of you does in your own very dynamic ways and interesting ways, then at the heart of the organization there has to be the same consecration to consciousness. There can be the same consecration to consciousness. And that means not having a power struggle, but bringing out the shadow that could produce the power struggle. You know, it means realizing that you're going to have different points of view, very different points of view. But in consecrated conversation, one of you speaks and nobody interrupts, ever. But you're not trying to dominate others. And if you are, you're going to get feedback about it when someone else speaks. But it's very important, this is an art. It's very important that you don't, it's not a postponed blaming or judgment process. It's really very heartful. And I think a board can do that. I have a small foundation, and I haven't been involved with it too much. It contributes money to people who participate. It gives scholarships to people who participate in my programs. But they do. We used to meet every year for a shadow meeting. You know? And when I had a community that I worked with, we'd had once a year, we'd bring out a lot of booze and say, this is a shadow night. Gurdjieff used to say, if you want to find out who a person really is, get them drunk. You know, we'd find out who hated who loved who wanted to be in bed with who, you know, all kind of things. That was a long time ago and in a different stage. But, you know, you already have an intuition of what I mean by consecrated conversation because you're intelligent and have lots of life experience. Do that for a while in the board meeting. Direct some of the time to creating a field where you start to trust each other more, where you're really creating a field of coherence that you like being with each other, even though you don't agree on many things. And what I know about a coherent field is that that's when we're the most intelligent, that's when we're the most connected to deep intelligence. And so I don't know that that naturally will translate to greater success for the organization in terms of its growth, but it will translate into something more coherent within the organization, which would certainly support growth. I just want this, I think it's so important for us to understand that a relationship is one person, two persons, three, four, but it's also a field. You could call that the third presence or the other. And that field wants something. So if you say to yourself, I want a relationship in which, I want a field or a situation in which we can truly work together in the most dynamic way possible, then you have to ask yourself, if that's what the relationship wants, how do I have to communicate and how do I have to listen? How do I have to communicate? Where do I communicate from? I think I'm giving you an example of it in myself in the moment from how I've been speaking. I know how vulnerable I feel. I'm not trying to disguise it. It may not appear from the outside, but it's very much in this body. And how do I listen? How do I communicate? How do I listen? Where do I listen from? To listen, not to interpret. To listen, not to find a flaw in the other. To listen, to hear the otherness of the other. Their point of view, their position, where they are, and to hear behind their words. You know? And my time is up. It's been a privilege to be with you. Thank you very, very much.